I think everybody could find something interesting out of something that I'm going to present here today. As Deb mentioned, just type your questions in the chat and I'll try and monitor that. Or if you prefer to take yourself off mute, that's fine too. We can go that route. It's not a terribly large group, I don't think. So I'm just going to pull up an agenda slide, and these are the 7 or 8, 7, I guess, items that I'm going to talk about today. Again, some of these are really quick, little short things that I maybe ran across with a customer over the last few months and just jotted it down. Like this first one, you'll see accessing layers during a copy geometry definition. So not a lot of meat behind these bullets here, but these are kind of the topics, and I can share the slide out if you want it, Deb, afterwards. If you're doing the recording here, and you can distribute this slide with the recording, maybe it'll help make sense as people go through the recording. So external shrink wrap and copy geom gives you access to simplified rep definitions as of Creo 8. So I'll be using Creo 8 today. And I'll touch on a few new things that, as I go through all of these different examples when it makes sense, if it is something new in Creo 8. A unit conversion display. I don't know if anybody on the call sits in on the tips and techniques sessions that Lino Tazi, one of my peers, has been delivering over the course of the last year or so. I just watched one of his not too long ago, and he did this thing that I didn't know you could do. I thought it was pretty cool, so I thought I'd show that. Seed and boundary, probably more of a refresher for most people, but every time I show doing something and I use seed and boundary selection, somebody always asks how you did that, so I'll do a little deep dive on seed and boundary. Another one I did for a customer recently, cam and slot geometry. Hadn't done one in a while, went through it for this customer, and I thought, it's probably something that would be interesting to a wider audience. And as you can see, I've sprinkled in a few other topics in here, like some behavior modeling on a few of these. The second to last one, a measure UI tip. So it's another quick one, but something that I think people find helpful. And then the last one is technique for using approximate curves. And again, just another kind of item sprinkled in there for looking at how you can utilize a field point if you're not familiar with what a field point is. So that's it for the slides. I'm going to go ahead and just jump into an example here. So that first one, accessing layers during copy geometry feature. So let me open up a model for that. Now in this one, the scenario kind of set the stage. We've got this assembly. It's probably one you guys have seen a million times over the years. This demo model tends to pop up all the time. But you might have a scenario. This customer was asking, how can he access layers while he creates a copy geometry feature from another assembly or part or whatever it is. And in that model, the thing he wants to copy is on a layer and hidden. So I always found that, for example, in this model we're going to copy from is this engine assembly. And the thing he wants to copy in this scenario is something from the skeleton model. So the skeleton in this case is hidden on a layer, and he wants to copy from that. Well, he doesn't have the benefit necessarily of opening this thing up first. He's in this model. You go to say, I want to create a copy geometry feature, and you tell it you want it to be external, open up that engine file, place it by default, and then you go into selection for that geometry. And this is when you realize the thing you want isn't available because it's hidden on a layer. And if you go over to the model tree and try and turn on layers, it's grayed out. So you've got a couple of ways you can potentially access the information. The first is if there's layer states set up in the model, you can access those through this view manager inside of the window. So in this case, if I go to views, the view manager and go to layers, I can turn on or off my skeleton here. Now, that's not always going to be the case. If layer states hadn't been used, you wouldn't see anything listed here. But I could turn those on there, and then I'd be able to make that selection. Another approach is to just come in and choose the edit placement. So you're basically backing up one step, and then you're going to go in under the options at the top of the model tree here, and now you'll see layer tree is available. So I can just toggle on the layer tree, scroll down here to my model, my second layer tree for the model I'm assembling. And from here, I can come in and show that layer, the appropriate layer that I want to get to. And then all I have to do is place the model again, in this case, just a default placement. But now you can see that when I go into my surface sets, those skeleton model is available for me to select from. It's no longer hidden geometry. So a couple of different ways you can get to it. Probably the most obvious is to just pause the feature definition by hitting that update placement option, and then you'll be able to access the layer definition from there. Okay, so I'll pause quickly and see if anyone's typing questions in. It doesn't look like there's anything in there right now, so we'll move on to the next item. All right, so this next one is external shrink wraps. So I'm gonna, before I open it up here in Creo 8, I'm gonna go ahead and launch Creo 7 and show you kind of the old behavior if you're not familiar with it. So give this just a second while I launch Creo 7 or any version prior to 8 would have the same behavior. So if I go into that same folder and I open up this model called gripper assembly. Again, probably a model you've seen over the years. Okay, so I've got this model here, and it's a, not a terribly complex thing, but again, this is something I ran across with customers over the years. Kind of drove me nuts that we couldn't do this. And what this is if you want to create a part that uses an external copy geometry or shrink wrap, and use the simplified rep that might be defined in here. So in this scenario, let's say that I've got a simplified rep called demo 1, which turns off the majority of the parts. Maybe I'm making a very simplified version of this thing to give to a design partner, a supplier, a customer, whatever the case might be. Well, in this scenario, I've turned off maybe all of the internal parts, and I've simplified, substituted a part that's a simplified version of these grippers, and just basically skinnied this thing down so that when I go to create a new part, we'll just take a default name here, and I go to create a shrink wrap, and I choose my external file for that shrink wrap, namely that gripper assembly. You'll notice what happens is it doesn't let me go in to that gripper assembly because I have one of the simplified reps active, and it tells me the external model must be in the master rep state. So your only option is to retrieve that model in its master state. Now I can do that if I go back to my model here and go back to master, and now do that same option here where I go to my part, create my shrink wrap, open up that same assembly. Now it'll let me open it, but it doesn't let me pick the simplified rep. If I want to get that version, that lightweight version defined in my assembly, I have to do it manually here. And I can't even really do it here necessarily. Let's say I want to say all the solid components. If I go under subset, I could kind of come in here and turn things off or on, but I can't do a replace. So in the case of these grippers, they got a lattice feature in here. I can't do a substitute on those things. So I'm really limited to just turning on or off the components that I want at this level. I can't do a replace or substitute. and basically I'm redoing the work that I already did in the assembly by creating that simplified rep. So that's the restriction that we removed in Creo 8. So I'm just going to jump out of 7 here, cancel this. And let's see, I think I got a couple things open here. And I'm just going to close Creo 7. So here we are back in Creo 8. Let me go into that same folder. Open up my same gripper assembly. So exact same model here in Creo 8. Go to my view manager. Here's our simplified rep, which again turns off a bunch of parts, lightweights it, turns off maybe some features I don't want to share. And then by substitution. So if I go in to create that new part now, and I go into a shrink wrap feature, and I open up that model, it asks me if I want the master or a representation. In my case, I want a representation. I'll place it in default coordinate system. I'll take the solids and I'll solidify everything, accept it. And there's my simplified model part file that I could share to somebody and not necessarily give them the entire model to use in maybe their assembly. And this is updatable. In other words, if I decided to go back to my master model, unless I made it independent, but I didn't in this case. So I could go back to my master model. Let's just do that real quick here. And what I'm going to do is just, let's edit the definition on that. And let's say I want to grab a few more of these parts. So maybe I want to include, some of these things here that maybe I didn't have in the first time around. So we'll just accept those and let's make those part of the master or part of the master setting for the rep. So I'm basically just adding these 3 parts. So those have been added into my simplified rep. So now when I go back to my part, if I just come over here and say I want to update my shrink wrap, tells me it might take a few minutes. Say okay. And down here I just select on demo 1 again, and it updates to include those parts into that shrink wrap. So you can select it out front, and then you can also have that associativity if you don't make it independent back to that original simplified rep or switch it to a different one. Okay. Any questions in the chat here? Hopefully this chat is updating. I've got it open, but I'm not seeing anything listed in there. So for the sake of time, I'm going to keep moving along. Unless, again, anybody has anything they want to take yourself off mute, that would be fine as well. So let's go ahead and switch folders here. And let's go ahead and go into this guy. And got a basic model here. This is just a freestyle feature. So that's our subdivisional modeling tool for doing surfacing. If you're not familiar with it, basically it's a surfacing tool that everybody has access to up here called Freestyle. And that Freestyle surface is what we have on the screen right now to model this bottle. So what I'm going to do is go in and make a couple of bodies, multi-body, one that represents the bottle and then one that represents the liquid inside the bottle. One of the things we did in Creo 8, which is nice, is a lot of these options up here in the editing group were always object action. In other words, you had to pick something before you saw the solidify become available for selecting. Now we've kind of removed that restriction. Now you can pick solidify first, pick on the quilt, and perform that function. Always kind of drove me nuts. Made it things like intersect difficult or trimming. You always had to pick things first, and that was the only place that we had that behavior. So they've kind of resolved some of that. All right, so we got our bottle. It's a solid right now. Let's go ahead and solidify that, or I'm sorry, shell that. So we'll just remove that surface, give it a wall thickness of some arbitrary value, doesn't really matter. And now we've got our body part. And okay, somebody's just testing the chat, I think. It's good. Looks like it's updating for me. So that's good. So we've got our body shelled out here. Again, one of the things we did in 8, this probably isn't a great example of it, but one of the things you can do in 8 for quilts or surfaces, you can pick on them. So in this case, this freestyle is a quilt. So I can come in here and I can say, show me a snapshot of what that geometry looked like at that point in time. So it's showing me in red. It's all inside the model because I shelled to the outside. So that's what our freestyle surface looked like. So if you can imagine doing a lot of surface modeling, and then you ultimately merge those surfaces together, you maybe do a thicken or an offset or solidify. And at the end of the day, you don't really see the surfaces on the screen, but you know that that geometry was made from surfaces. So you can just come in here and say, show me a snapshot of what that looks like. And that's what we're seeing in red right now. So I'm going to actually use the copy snapshot. And what that does is it copies that quilt at its point in time and definition and inserts a copy for me in the model tree right after it. So now I can use this copy of the freestyle feature to build my body that's going to represent the liquid or the volume inside of this bottle. So again, to do that, let me touch on one other thing in Creo 8. So right now we've got the body defined as the bottle. Let me just rename that so we can make sense of it. So there's our bottle body, the outside plastic. We've also got a quilt folder now. So you can see our quilt is the one we just copied. And what I want to do is make another body out of that quilt. So I'm just going to do a second solidify. But this time, when I do the solidify, I'm going to go under body options and say, create a new body. So now I've got no longer have a quilt in my model, in my design items. I've got 2 bodies. The second body is going to represent our liquid. Okay. So this liquid is filled to the top right now. We don't really want that. Let me just change the color of one of these so we can kind of differentiate that a little bit. So we'll make the bottle blue. Okay, so my liquid is gray inside. One of the things you can do also while you're working, if you've got multi-body parts, I can say, for example, this bottle temporarily, I want to make it transparent, but I don't want the liquid to be transparent. So if I set transparency on the bottle, you may have noticed in some of the updates, we've got these sliders now for transparency. So I've said, let me slide the transparency of the bottle over, but not the liquid. So I only made the bottle transparent. So again, just when you're working in these different environments, you can shade different models different ways. So we're looking at the bottle semi-transparent. The liquid is the gray part. I don't want to fill the liquid to the top of the bottle. I want to have a little bit of headspace up there. So I'm going to go in and just do a quick flexible modeling feature where I take this surface and let's just go in and move that. I'll just do it incrementally and drag it down, say 1 inch. So I'm basically just removing some of that material off the top of that body to represent the fill line that we want this to go to. So now we've got our bodies defined, our liquid in our bottle. Now we're going to get to the actual, the meat of the bullet, which is, I want to find out what the volume is of that liquid. So under analysis, I'm going to go in and make a mass property measurement. And I'm going to do it on a body, not the overall part. So I'm going to say for this body, the liquid body, I want to capture that as a feature. And I want to capture the volume. Okay. So now that I've done that, you can see our mass property volume is over here. If I look at it, Let's go to feature information. You can see here's volume, and it's currently at two places here. So 115.5 cubic inches, which isn't really what I'm after. I want to understand this in terms of maybe gallons or liters. Well, I could probably use Siri to figure that out. That's about the only thing Siri's good for. You know, how many tablespoons are in a cup, that kind of stuff. So I could do that, but I'm still designing this thing. I don't think in terms of cubic inches. I think in terms of gallons, let's say. So what I can do is let Creo do that conversion for me. And I could do that with another analysis feature, or I could do it with what's called a relation analysis. So we're just going to say I want to create a relation. And what I can do is come in here and create a parameter, and I'm going to call it gallons. And it's going to be a number, but over here, my units for this are going to be gallons. Okay, so now I've just created a parameter called gallons that's in the volume quantity with a unit of gallons. So now I can come up here and say, I want gallons to equal, I can insert, and it's a feature, pick on my mass properties. There's my original volume, the one that I created the analysis feature from. I'm going to insert that. So it's going to tell me gallons is now equal to that feature ID for that. That's our measurement we made earlier. We'll go ahead and accept that. And so now I could come in here and say, well, let's look at what the value of my analysis feature is. So it's gallons is the name of the parameter, and it is half a gallon. So if you move that over, it's 0.5 gallons. So if I come up here, maybe I want to create, I'm still designing this thing. Maybe I want to create an annotation. I'll do it with a liter note. And let's just put it on this top surface. And let's make it bigger so we can see it. And we're going to type in that cryptic name that you have to always look up if you don't do this a lot, which is ampersand gallon, colon, feature ID underscore. And since I have my feature IDs conveniently turned on over here, I can see that analysis is 1237. So I can just type that in. And maybe I put a space gallons after it. And why didn't that work? Spell something wrong. Oh, I think I had gallons was my parameter name, not gallon. Maybe, maybe not. No, let's look at it. So we'll say next, gallons is equal to that. And that is feature ID 1237. I don't know what I'm typing in wrong here, but there it is. I don't know, maybe I just didn't finish the note definition, but you can see it's listing whatever units I put in there now. So 0.5 gallons. I've saved this model. I was going to shoot for 0.5 gallons, but maybe I want to go for, some other amount in here. So this is where I'm going to use a little behavior modeling to do that. So if I look at my sketch that controls part of the shape of this bottle, I've got a sketch right here. If we go in and edit that, I've got a dimension on this kind of the egg shape that defines the bulk of the body here, or I can come in and double click on that and I can push it out to 4, let it rebuild. Now I'm at 0.55 gallons. That note updates automatically. So maybe I'm shooting for, say I'm shooting for exactly 0.45 gallons in this thing. So I could double click on this and I could say, well, 4 is too much. That gives me a little over half a gallon. Let's see what 3 gives me. Well, 3 gives me 0.44. That's pretty close. So I can sit here and mess around with this number and get to that 0.45 or 0.5 or whatever my goal is. But I can let the system do that for me with behavior modeling. So it's just a quick look at how you might leverage behavior modeling to do this. So we're at 0.44 right now. I'm just going to go under analysis, do a quick optimization, and I'm going to say, take my parameter called gallons. I'm not going to use the one that it was originally measured in. I'm going to say, I want gallons to equal, I don't know, let's say 0.45. That's what we're going to shoot for. Okay. And then the dimension that can vary is going to be that 3, which is where it's at right now. So I'm just going to vary that from, say, 2 to 4. That's what I'm going to tell the system it can vary between. And I'm going to say I want to optimize this within some convergence value. So I'll just say converge within 0.1%. So that should get me a pretty darn good number. And then when you're done, you just go ahead and say compute. And it's going to take off, run the optimization, and give me the exact number once it solves to get to that 0.45 gallons. Close that out. It asks if you want to confirm that. I can save it as a feature, so it always optimizes to 0.45 gallons. So if I accidentally go in and change that number, it's always going to regenerate back to 0.45 if I want. So that's just a really simple example of behavior modeling, as well as changing the units to work in the units that you want, or display, I should say. Okay. So I'm just going to check the chat here. Doesn't look like there's anything new in the chat. So I'm just going to keep moving along and assume you guys will type your questions in or take yourself off mute. So let's go ahead and switch to my next one. So again, this is probably a refresher for most. Seed and boundary technique. This is a selection technique in Creo, been around forever in Pro E. But again, it's one of those things when I'm working with somebody and I gather up a bunch of surfaces quickly, they're always like, wait a minute, how did you do that? So it's just a technique for selecting things. So for example, if I wanted to grab all the surfaces in this pocket here and copy it to do something, I want to offset that or whatever it is I'm trying to do by copying them in the first place. I could pick on that surface. I could hold down Control and I can, go around and grab up everything that I want. And I could spin the model and continue Control and grab more stuff. But seed and boundary lets you define a seed surface. That's going to be the first surface you select. And then you're going to switch and use Shift and pick on the boundaries. So if you think of like Microsoft Word, when you do Shift, it's a kind of a from to. You pick the first thing in the list that you want to start selecting from. That's the equivalent of what we just picked here. And then our boundary in Word would be the last thing in the list that you want to gather everything in between. And that's what we're doing here. So I'm going to hit Shift. I'm going to pick on this surface and this surface and let go of Shift. And there's everything inside of that selection that we want. So it starts at the seed, keeps mapping out adjacent surfaces until it hits what I call the boundary. So that's pretty easy on a little piece of geometry like that. But let's say we want to gather up all the surfaces on the inside of this housing. This is a pretty simple housing, but hopefully it'll illustrate another approach that you can take. So I could take and start my seed surface, go ahead and hit Shift, and I'm going to grab that. And I know that this thing I want because it is open to the inside. And I'll just spin over here and grab this end. And now when I let go, it's grabbing not only the inside surfaces, but the outside surfaces. So not real obvious. This is a simpler model. I could probably figure it out. I could keep spinning my model around, but it gets difficult when, there's a lot of these little holes you're looking for to kind of patch over with your Shift and Select. So one of the things you can do is say copy and paste. and then go into the details of your references. And that's going to bring up the list of all of the surfaces that are selected up until this point. So in this case, I've got 793 surfaces selected using that seed and boundary technique. So what I can do is I can come in here and turn off the preview. So we're looking at the preview right now in orange. That's all the surfaces it's gathered. If I turn that off, I can go into my list of bounding surfaces and just work around my model. I don't have to hold anything down. I'm just spinning my model around. I can see, okay, here's another hole that goes back into the model. So now I can control and pick another boundary here, do a quick preview. Still got a bunch of surfaces on the outside, so I'm missing a hole somewhere. So I can kind of spin this thing around. Now here's another surface right here that has, looks like a hole going into the model. So again, I'm going to hold down control, pick this as a boundary, do another check to see if I have any other surfaces I need to look for. At this point, it looks like I got them all. It looks like all I've got are internal surfaces right now. So I could go ahead and accept that and finish out my option. Now, if I was trying to build a volume, let me just change the color of that surface so you can see it. So let's just make it green. Let's see, the quilt right here. Okay, so I've got all those surfaces internally copied. If I were trying to cap this off and make a body out of it to measure the volume, kind of like I did with the bottle, I can do that. And what I think a lot of people would do is come in here and sketch a bunch of flat surfaces and then merge them in. And one of the things we added a couple releases ago, probably in the early Creo time frame, maybe even going back to Wildfire 5 or something like that, I don't remember. But when you do a surface copy, so say I want to pick this face right here, I can do a copy, paste, and one of the options I have is to say untrim to envelope. And what that does is it untrims that surface copy to the outside envelope of that face. So I don't have to sketch that. And the nice thing about that is if I delete that and I go in and say I want to take this face, this face, this face, this face, and the back. I can come in now and say copy paste, and I go under options and I can untrim them all at the same time. So I get all of those flat faces over all of those surfaces that I can then go in and do a merge between all those quilts and get that single volume. Now, it creates them as individual quilts, but so I'd have to go in and say I want to merge this one with, you know, pick the inside of the surface. So maybe I would take that one and this one, do my merge, go to the inside. So it gets a little redundant here. So now I cap that off. So I could do a copy paste of my merge, grab this face. I want to keep to the bottom and just keep going through until I end up with one quilt that represents the inside of this part. So just a couple of things around surface copies and seed and boundary type selection techniques. All right. Cam slots. Let's go into that one. So again, this is one I just a couple weeks ago ran into with the customer. Wanted to know how to build a slot profile into a part that ultimately we're going to have a part right along that curve that goes down inside of this thing. So you could do it a number of ways. What I did in this particular example was I just sketched a line that we see here. It's just a regular sketch, and I placed it on a datum plane that was tangent to this surface and parallel to one of my default datums. So nothing fancy there. I go in and look at it. It's just a simple sketch. Now I'm going to wrap this curve onto this part after this. And one of the things that works well with a wrap feature is by placing a coordinate system. So you can kind of see a coordinate system here. That's just one of these coordinate systems in Sketcher. And that's going to be the origin of my wrap. So I placed a coordinate system there at the origin of my sketch, and nothing else fancy about this. It's just a line, a spline, and another line of equal length to the first line with some tangency defined on the spline. That's all this sketch is. So then what you can do is come in here and say, I want to take that curve. Under editing, you've got a wrap feature that lets me wrap that curve onto my part. Okay, so now I've got that curve kind of projected. It's not projected, it's actually wrapped. So if I look at the length of my original curve, so there's my original curve, my sketched one. We go in and measure that. You can see it's 2.82 something. Right? And if I go and pick on this curve that I wrapped, and we measure it, exact same length, 2.82479. So I've got that wrapped onto my model. Let's go ahead and hide our original one. Now I want to use that to create a sweep, to create that cut. So I'm just going to go in and create a sweep feature. And I'm going to go in and make it a remove material, go into the sketch. Now, one of the things for a slot connection is you want your curve at the center of your slot in most cases, because I'm going to have a pin coming through that slot that's going to ride on that curve. So when I sketch my cut here, I'm going to actually make it kind of centered symmetrically about the center of my spline. Okay, and we'll make it, my part I happen to know is a 1/4 inch slot we need for it. So we'll go ahead and sweep that on that geometry. And now we've got our profile here. And that is driven by that original sketch. So if I come in here and modify this sketch and say, I want that to be, 3 inches long, that's obviously going to update my wrap. And now we've got something that's a little bit longer. So now what if I want this to wrap 180 degrees around my part? Well, I started with this sketch that's out here, 3 inches long. How do I figure out how to get that into that angle that I want going around this diameter, this circumference? I could go out and find the dimensions and, again, maybe ask Siri to help me with that. But I want to go in and let the system do it for me. So again, I'm going to go into analysis. I'm going to make a measurement. I'm going to say from this surface here over to here, this planar surface is at an angle of 27 degrees. So it'd be 180. I want that's this angle right here, 27. I want that to be driven to 0. So again, I'm going to come in here and say I want to capture this as a feature. So we're going to say, yep, I want a feature. And what I want to capture is the angle. So now I've got a measurement over here for my angle that I want to drive to 0. So same thing as before, go under optimization. I want to say, make my angle measurement, set that to 0 in this case. And to get there, I'm going to go in and let this length of 3 inches vary. So that length I'm going to say could maybe be as short as 2, which I know won't get me there. And we'll say can go out to, I don't know, say 5. Hit compute. System solves for it, tells me it needs to be exactly 3.53 something. Close that out, keep my dimension, and now I've got a measurement of a full 180 degrees going around this part. So I don't have to think about what that length should be. If I need it in angles, I just let the system do it for me. So now I've got my slot and I've got my curve sitting here. From here, I want to build, right now my curve goes out to the end of my slot. So let me just repaint this. You can see my curve is right at the end of this thing, and I'm going to put a pin in here to follow this. So I need a little more material here, cut away, and you can do that however you want. I could create a cut that, you know, it's on an edge, build a plane through this edge, normal to, you know, this face or whatever, and then sketch a cut there. Or I can do something like flexible modeling. Just grab this face, say I want to move that. I'm going to move it incrementally back this way. Half of my slot width is 1/4 inch, so I'm going to move it back 1/8 of an inch. And we'll do the same thing over here. Do another move incrementally. Grab that same value. And then I could do something like, let's just go and create a round. Grab that and that, make it a full round. Come over here, kind of do the same thing. So we'll do a new set here and here, full round. And now I've got clearance for where my pin needs to start and then ride that curve. So my part's ready. Let's go ahead and build a quick assembly. We'll bring in that first component, which is that cam part. I'm just going to locate it with a default constraint. And my other part is already modeled, so it's my slot part. So we'll just go ahead and assemble that. And I'm going to take this cylinder and drop it inside of here. And I'm going to convert that to a pin joint. So now it's free to rotate. What I want to do is take this pin that I've got coming out the side here, and I want this point on the pin to ride on this curve that we defined. So I'm going to create a new set. I'm going to create it as a slot. And then I'm going to say on my purple part here, I want to grab that point and I'm going to have it ride on this curve. Now, it picked just the first entity here. So this would be a good place to use a composite curve, but I didn't do that. So I'm just going to hold down Control and gather up all of those curves for it to ride along. And we'll go ahead and accept that as our placement. So we got our part assembled. And from here, if I zoom out a little bit, you can see if I drag that part now, it rides up that slot and follows that curve 180 degrees around. Okay. All right, we're at 1:45. Any questions? I've got nothing in the chat. I am just going to keep moving along unless I hear something. I've got just a couple more to go. This is a quick one. Measure tip for measuring. So if I come in and I want, you know, on a part like this, maybe I want to measure from this face out here back to a bunch of surfaces. I want to understand what those dimensions are. So I think what most people probably do is pick on that face, pick on this face, go do a measure, and they can see that distance is 20.25 millimeters, or maybe they do an actual distance measure of 20.25. And now if you pick on this next face, it clears the buffer. I have to go and pick both surfaces again. So I can see it's 30.25 millimeters. Same thing. If I come over here, I got to pick both surfaces again, 40.25. If I have a bunch of things that I want to measure coming off of one face, I can use, it's called a replace command. So if I just clear this out and I pick on this first surface, and the first thing you want to measure to tells me that dimension. So I can come up here on that second surface, just right click, and you'll see an option that says replace. So now with replace chosen, I don't have to hold down Control or anything. I can just say, show me that dimension to this face, 20.25. Go to the next one, 30.25. Go to the next one, 40.25. So you can just sit here and pick in the scenario where you might want to measure a bunch of things. You can just use that replace option. Now you can also have that be the default. There's a config.pro option called, have to look it up. I can't remember what it is. measure something, measure auto replace mode. If you set that to yes, and you do a distance, angle, or transform measurement, replace will automatically be activated for you. So you don't have to go in and do that right click and activate replace. And then along the lines of the unit display, we added this a while back, but again, it's kind of one of those things that if you didn't see the enhancement, you might not know it's even in there. So again, if we come under here and we do a measurement of distance, and I pick on this surface, I pick here, it tells me it's 10.52 millimeters. Well, maybe I want to know what that is in inches. So you can go under this little info button here. Oops, sorry, wrong button. This little page here, and I can say, show me the length in units in inches. So I can scroll down, get to inches, and then that's going to change all my measurements that I'm making inside of this measure command to show me what they are in inches, or whatever units you chose in that dropdown, regardless of what the model units are. Okay, so that's just a quick one on measure. And we got one more that should take us right up to the last 5 minutes. So let's go in here. This is one I've probably shown before, an old one that I pulled out. I ran into this similar item recently, but I'll go through it again. I think it's definitely something people benefit from when you're doing a lot of, I'll say, complex geometry. So in this scenario, I've got this block sitting here that's just a single body. I'm just going to hide that for a minute. And you can see I've got some sketched curves that I want to cut out this type of shape out of that body. So if let's do it this way. Let's unhide it. So you can see here's the start of that curve. Here's where it ends. And then I had the two curves that were kind of the guide rails for it. That's the shape that I want to remove out of here. So again, I'm going to hide the body that's here right now. So we'll just hide that temporarily. And I'm going to go in and build the quilt that represents this geometry using a boundary blend. So I'm going to come in here and say, I want this kind of circular shape to blend to this shape. I've got my start points in opposite corners, so I'm just going to move it over to here. So there's my boundary blend in one direction. So I'm going to say in the second direction, I want to go from this curve to this curve. And I end up with this shape that looks like what we have on the screen here. It's a little messy, but that's the shape I'm after. So if I bring back our body and I go and say, I want to do a solidify using that shape, I want to remove to the other side. I've got my shape here. And again, I can hide my quilt if I want to temporarily turn that off. There's my cut and my part, looks good. But now I want to come in and add a few rounds. And I'm just going to say I want to maybe put a 1/2 inch round over here, whatever units I'm working in. And one over here. And one up here. And you can already see what's happening. I'm not getting my full preview of my round. It's not going to let me put in a 1/2 inch round. And the reason for that is it's self-intersecting when you're running over all of these little patches. And that happens a lot. Sometimes you can fix it. Sometimes you got to go back and look at it, creating your geometry a different way. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to cancel out of this round. And I'll look at building that quilt in a little nicer, cleaner way. So let's hide our body. And I'm going to come into my quilt and I'm just going to say, let's just go ahead of it. We'll do it a whole different way. So the reason it's giving me all those edges is you can see how this sketch was made. It's actually not just it's a smooth line, but it's made up of a line, an arc, a tangent arc, another line, and the bottom one is, some other small pieces. And everywhere you have one of these vertices, you get that curvature connection between this curve and the curve above. And that's why I get all those pieces in this model. So one of the things you can do is create a copy of this curve. So I'm just going to say copy and paste. I'm going to create it as an approximate curve. When you do an approximate curve, it fits a spline over all of those entities, giving me a nice smooth curve. So I'll do the same thing down here. Copy, paste, approximate. And now I've got two new curves that I can use for my boundary blend. Now, usually somebody asks, well, how accurate is that copied curve? It's a spline fit through that geometry. It's pretty darn accurate. And I can tell that if I go and use a tool called a field point. So if I put a field point on this curve, I want to make sure I put it on the copy. So there's our copy. Now that's going to say that field point can move anywhere along that geometry that I selected. And what I'm going to do is make a measurement from that field point to our original curve. So let me query and get to the full sketch. There it is. And you can see it's a distance of 0. So that one's right on the money. So I'm going to save that as a feature. And I'm going to capture that distance. I'm not going to put any points in here. I'm just going to say capture that distance. And what I'm going to do over here is grab the field point and the measure, and I'm going to create what's called a local group. You need to do that to run this next user-defined analysis. So I'm going to say I want to create a user-defined analysis of that local group that's going to show me the distance over the entire field of that point. So when I hit compute, it's going to take that field point and move it across that curve, our copied curve, and it's going to measure at each location the distance to our original sketch. So you can see, here's the graph of that. In its worst condition, it's 0.00016 inches away from my original curve. Pretty darn close. I guess you have to decide if that's close enough. If it's not, you can adjust the accuracy of your model, and that'll actually improve that spline definition, that approximate curve. You can see here's our min and max. Okay, so that's how close my copy approximate is. I'm going to call it good enough for what I'm doing. So I'm just going to hide this group here. So now let's rebuild our surface. So we're going to go back here, say we want to do our boundary blend, same as before. I'm going to say go from here to here, move our start points. Second direction is going to go from our copied curve to our copied curve down here. Now I've got a couple extra lines in here. That's because I didn't define some control points. So I've got one long line here. So I'm just going to say, let's go ahead and define a control point from here to this corner. We'll say the same thing over here. This, I could have done this earlier too, but it really wouldn't have helped because all my extra lines were coming from the curve in this direction. So now we've got a really nice, clean, smooth surface. I got rid of all that noise, if you want to think of it that way, in that surface. It's the same shape, but it's a much cleaner resulting geometry. So now if I bring our solid back and I do our solidify and create our cut using that surface, go ahead and hide our quilt again. See our resulting cut inside there, nice and clean. Let's see if we can get our round to go. Hopefully it won't make a liar out of me. There's our 1/2 inch. You can see already it's giving me a preview. Looks good, accept that. And we've got our round that goes in nicely now, behaves well. All right. So that is the end. That was as many as I had prepared. It looks like my timing was pretty good. We're 3 minutes before the hour. No questions came in. If anyone has any final ones, shout them out or type them in. Otherwise, Deb, I'll turn it back over to you.